Welcome to Capture the World with D. Interviews with companies and individuals to learn more about digitally capturing the built world. Video, drone, 3D tours, pictures, panoramas, and more. And now your host, a social influencer and community activist, D. Johnson.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Capture the World with D. I'm your host, D. Johnson. Today's podcast is sponsored by iGuide, a proprietary camera and software platform for capturing and delivering immersive 3D tours and extensive property data. My guest today is the marketing manager at iGuide and a guru in measuring properties. He's just full of information, so I hope today you're going to learn a lot. So without further ado, please help me welcome Chris White.
Wow, thanks for having me. What an intro. Holy moly.
Hi, Chris. How are you?
Pretty good. How are you?
Chris is joining us today from his comfy couch.
This is part of my guru status. I was told that it looks very guru-y, so I was like, well, I'll just lean into it, I guess. That works.
You look very comfy.
I can't complain. It's a pretty good setup, to be honest. Absolutely. Thank you for having me on. For those who don't know, I have a lot of experience shooting real estate photography, but also measuring properties using different technologies. So the iGuide, obviously, but also manually measuring properties. I worked for many years creating floor plans manually for real estate transactions, but also for energy audits and home inspections and all sorts of reasons. Anytime someone would pay me for it, I guess. Yeah. So I guess today, just sort of summarize, what we're probably going to talk about for the most part. It'll be, the importance of measuring a property, why it's important, because some people don't necessarily see the value right away. Hopefully I'll be able to explain it. And then also kind of how that fits into your business or your life or your workflow, depending on where you're at. There's lots of different types of people who are thinking about measuring spaces, and for lots of different reasons. So it's this will be a bit general, but for the most part, my experience comes from a real estate one. So I'll probably speak to that quite a bit. But by the end of this, hopefully, the takeaway will be that people will see why measuring a property is extremely important. Why it's valuable, and then have a basic knowledge on how to do that, manually, because I'm going to describe that process, or how to use maybe something more advanced, iGuide, wink, right? So with that out of the way, what I'm going to do is load up a slide, and we're going to dive right in. Is that okay?
Yep, sounds good.
Oh, this is so exciting. Okay, hold on. All right, can you see my screen?
Yes.
All right, fantastic. So what I thought we'd do is we'd go through some, basic terminology and just really simple concepts around measurement before we talk about how to draw your own floor plan. Because you might think to yourself, I'm not really interested in floor plans. I remember when I was shooting real estate, like I would have my clients, ask me for things. I'd have people ask me for things, right? And whenever someone asks you for something, you consider whether or not you should say yes, which is, I'll give you an example, but someone comes up to you and they say, hey, I love your photos. They're so cool, but do you do, walkthrough videos? Mm-hmm. And so, it's not that hard to figure out how to do something like that. You might say yes, and you might get into that. You might go in that direction based on what your client is asking for, right? Mm-hmm. Because if they're asking for it, then there might be other people. I had a lot of people ask for floor plans specifically. Funny, not so much 3D tours, but that's like obviously because of reasons. That's like a huge thing now, much bigger than it was before. But 3D tours, virtual tours in general. I've been around for, oh good Lord, a long time now, right? Like 20 years in one form or another. But measurement floor plans was always important. It was something that I got asked for. And there was a very specific reason that people would ask for it. And it wasn't because of its value and its uses, although we'll talk about that in a second. I'll go to the next slide so you guys can see that. It was because it was required. So I'll just preface this whole conversation by saying that if you're thinking about getting it into measurement, measuring properties, creating floor plans, that kind of stuff, you'll either kind of be thinking about considering it, for reasons, or you'll basically have to do it because in your area, it might be mandated that square footage and floor plans are required to list a property. And that's happened in a few different locations across, North America. Most notably in Canada and Western Canada and Alberta, there's a residential measurement standard. And that's been huge, absolutely huge for technologies like iGuide, but also people who focus on measurement, obviously, because you have to have floor plans and measurements to list a property at all. And they have to follow a very specific set of rules. There's a few other locations that are very specific, or that are similar, I should say. North Carolina, I believe, requires this as well. And then all across North America, there are varying sets of rules with local MLSs where they may or may not require totals. To give you an example, where I live, you don't need to have straight up like full, standardized floor plans or anything, but you have to report as a real estate professional. You have to report the total square footage of a property when you're listing it. So how you get that number, it's not super clear, but
yes. So my friends up in Canada all need the total square footage. But the big issue for them is, how do I know it's accurate?
Because right. Well, we're gonna touch on that today.
Yeah,
that's a big deal, right? There are a zillion sources of square footage, and that's the biggest thing that the biggest question I would say that comes up when you start kind of getting into this. So I'll bring it up in a few minutes, but using the information that's accurate or that you're confident in is really important, because if you misrepresent a property, that can be quite dangerous, to be frank. If you say something's bigger or smaller than it actually is, then you're opening yourself up to risk and liability, and that makes people upset when you sell them something that's not what they thought they were getting. Either way, we'll get to that. That's like 2 slides away. On this one, you can see that I've listed 3 things here. I've also included some really critical, important graphics there for you. My favorite one is the family with the kid. I didn't make this slide, by the way. I just borrowed it from someone. But square footage information is really, really important. So it's important, just obviously off the top, I said, because people ask for it. So if it's something that you can, as a business person, sell them, okay, that's awesome. But in addition to that, square footage information is really important for a few other things. And now these are all gonna relate to real estate in some way, but they don't necessarily have to be tied to real estate transactions. That's just my background. But determining value, right? So when you are having a conversation with your listing agent, so let's suppose you go to sell your home and you sit down at a table with a real estate professional, and they're going to help you through this process. Or even if you're going to do it yourself, you're going to take into account certain variables, and you're going to try to come up with a price to sell your house for. You're going to guess, and you're going to look at all sorts of things. You're going to look at other properties in your area. You're going to look at what features you have, lot size, all that stuff. And one really big part of that is square footage.
Yep.
Measuring a property to get the square footage is very useful for determining its value, because you can have 2 houses side by side on the same street that will sell for different prices because one is a slightly bigger house and one is a slightly smaller house, and that's totally normal. Often it's not as big a deal in terms of determining price maybe as it should be. Often, it's real estate, right? It's location, and then everything else kind of comes after that. But it's a really important number because it's so easily communicated. How big is this house? 2,500 square feet. I get it. You know what I mean? So for determining that value, for putting a price on it, that's really great during that listing conversation. Fun fact, almost all of the measurement for a property is done after that listing presentation has already occurred. Because in a typical scenario, you hire a listing agent to sell your house, and they don't hire a company to measure it or create floor plans until you've hired them to sell it. So they're having that conversation based on other types of measurement information, which we'll get to in a minute.
Well, my understanding is in New York City, houses are sold based on square footage.
Oh, New York's huge. Actually, I should have mentioned that. Yeah, they're like, it's a big deal, especially with regards to multi-unit residential buildings and structures that have unique features and stuff. Yeah, they're like down to the square inch.
I know,
that makes
I've
sense.
had people contact me going, did you include the windowsill?
Yeah.
I'm like, what?
Yeah, it's very granular. Yeah, that's true. So determining value, that's obviously useful for a lot of different people. You've got the listing agent, the seller, and obviously the person buying the home, because they're going to be spending that money. But it's super useful, the square footage information, when you're comparing different properties. So this is kind of a similar thing, but it's from the perspective of, say, like a buyer now. So I want to buy a house in a particular neighborhood, and I've got two to choose from. When I list all the stats, for those properties, well, one of them is probably going to be size, right? Square footage. And that data has legs. Like we it's important in the sense that it sits in our minds and we talk about it for years to come. We just got a new house. You're telling your aunt or whatever that you moved in. Oh, it's 3,500 square feet. It's awesome. It's so much bigger than our old house. Like, it's like a big deal. And then, later, usually, for still in the context of a real estate transaction, or maybe even during, that information can be used for planning. So this is more floor plans than anything else. But planning is just a catch-all term that can mean sort of planning how you're going to use the space, as in like, little Bobby gets this bedroom and little Tammy gets this one, or more like we're going to do a full kitchen reno and we need to know if we can knock this wall out or that kind of stuff. So measurement, square footage information has a lot of value throughout the entire lifetime of the property, before it's sold, during the sale, after the sale, when the homeowner is then at any point when they live there is going to make changes, they're going to plan that space. This information is valuable, and that really comes out when you're talking about this. So if you haven't taken that step and you haven't started doing floor plans or measurements or any of that stuff, it is considered to be a high value thing. Like floor plans they're considered to be difficult to get, relatively speaking. I mean, photography is hilarious. People think it's so easy. They're like, oh, you just buy a really expensive camera and you go and you just push a button, right? But it's much more difficult than that. But floor plans, people kind of get it. They're like, oh yeah, you got to measure a house. It's very specific. We want it to be accurate.
So a little anecdote. This week, my son who's moving called me and said, I called him and said, hey, I found this property you might like. And the first question he asked me was, what is the square footage? And I'm like, wait, you're renting. And that's the thing you care about. So that was interesting too. It's not just when you're buying, apparently.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. Well, we had the same experience. Our previous house looked bigger on paper than it really was, because it was older and it had a smaller, or it had no basement, essentially. I mean, it did have a basement, but it was like haunted and gross. So we never went down there because it was too spooky. Well, the thing is, fun fact, when we moved into the house, we go down to the basement and we know it's gross, right? Like we bought it knowing full well we'd never really use the basement. But then on the wall, someone had hung a badminton racket at the back, and that badminton racket had a big handprint on it. So it just looked like there was a bloody handprint on the back wall. So I mean, talk about have a crazy thing in your basement. Anyway, that was super spooky. But either way, when we moved to our new house, this lovely house, we were super concerned about square footage, right? Like we're like, how big is it? What's the square footage like? Because we were craving that extra space. We had 2 kids in one room. They weren't happy about it, and we were so excited about kind of moving everyone to their own spaces, and the square footage was like a really big deal for us. Now that once you move in, you don't even think about it anymore. You could always go for a bigger house, right? We thought this house was so massive when we moved in, and now we're like, no, it seems kind of small, I don't know. It's all relative, right? All right, moving on. I think I'm just going to define the basics of measurement and square footage, just so we have a base level understanding, so that if anybody listening doesn't know what we're talking about, probably should have done this off the get-go. They'll have a basic wherewithal to know what square footage the term means, and then what measurement means, because it's a very broad term. So when I say square footage, what I mean is a calculation that refers to the area occupied by something. So we typically talk about square footage like a number, but it's really not a number. It's a calculation. So, and that calculation it's always length times width. But in the real world, it's way more complicated than that. This actually is a really great example. If you look at the picture on screen, you can see there's like a weird octagonal room, I think. 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, it's space down here. And that's totally normal, right? So when you have an L-shaped room, what does length times width mean anymore? Well, it doesn't quite add up, but the gist of it, if every room were a perfect rectangle, length times width. But the real question here is not what that square footage, how it's calculated, length times width, however you want to get that. It's what it includes and what it doesn't include. So if I were to say the most important thing that we're going to talk about today, it is this thing that I'm about to mention and go through. There's a couple slides here. And it's sort of know your numbers, So everyone, when they look at a floor plan can get something different. When we're talking about a square footage number, it's not as simple as a house is 2,500 square feet. There's all sorts of other variables that go into it. And if you're not familiar with measurement, if anyone listening is just brand new, I'm so sorry because I'm about to ruin it for you. So I'm going to give you some fun facts. If you send a fun fact, if you send 5 people to measure a property, you will get 5 different square footage totals, and you will get 5 slightly different floor plans. And that's totally normal and acceptable. Nothing wrong with that. Often we talk in these terms of like absolute numbers, like a property is 2,500 square feet, and you're confident in that. But there's so many small variables that go into calculating that number. The windowsills is a good example. That there's always going to be some margin for error, and there's going to be some difference from one person to the next. Either way, whenever there are discrepancies, it's good to have a basic understanding about that number when you yourself are referring to it. So for example, if I say my house is 1,600 square feet, rather than take that at face value, what you should do, I'm getting very preachy here, I apologize. What one should do is ask, okay, well, what's included in that number? And that is the most important thing that you can nail down in terms of measurement is when you're referring to these numbers, regardless of where you get them from. If you measured a property yourself, or you shoot an iGuide, or you have some other tour provider create a floor plan for you, what is included in the total and in the floor plan and what is not, because that will get you into the most trouble. Absolutely 100% the most trouble. So just before I get into the different areas, I'll give you an example of where just simple wording can just get you into so much trouble. So I am a listing agent and I'm listing a house, and I say this house is 3,500 beautiful square feet of living space. And I had my floor plans made. I looked at the measurement details. I know the numbers, we're all good. And then later the homeowner says, hey, or after they buy the house, they say, hey, look, you sold me a house. You said it was 3,500 square feet of living space, but now I'm looking at it and you quoted me the gross floor area, as in the whole footprint of the property. That's not 3,500 square foot of living space. That's like 3,100 square feet. You owe me the difference. You sold me something. You said it was 3,500, but it's not. It's 3,100. So we've got 400 square feet that you owe me money for, and I can attach a dollar amount to every single square foot. And that's the scariest scenario in terms of liability.
Sure.
When we used to do more agent presentations along this line, often real estate professionals would always wonder, would say, well, okay, if I order floor plans from a third party, and there was an issue of litigation, wouldn't they just get sued? And the answer is almost always no. Your reputation's on the line here. Your face is on the sign. And if they can't sue you, they're going to move on to the next person and the next person and the next person.
Well, they're just going to include everybody.
Well, it depends on where you are in North America, because in some states it's just line everybody up, sue them all at once. Yeah, 100%.
Deepest pockets.
Okay, we'll move on quickly. I don't want to take up too much time yapping about liability, but the first and most important and easiest, I would say, square footage or area calculation that we'll refer to is interior area. So think of interior area as the space inside a property that you can walk around on for the most part. It's a little more complicated because there's interior walls, but that's the living space, if you will.
Often, sometimes referred to as paint to paint.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Or baseboard to baseboard sometimes is the thing.
Okay.
The interior area is important because that's like the space you have to work with when you're actually using a property, So for a prospective buyer or somebody who's doing space planning, I mean, that's kind of really what you want to know, right? Interior area is almost always, well, it's not almost, it is, with a couple exceptions, always what you will be measuring when you're measuring from the inside out. So if you're creating a floor plan of a property, you're going to be basically making your drawings, and you're going to be measuring the inside of a space. And there are benefits to that form of measurement, because if you measure from the inside out, you can take into account all sorts of details that may or may not be usable square footage, like open to below spaces, and other features that you can't see from the outside. So if you can't see it from the outside, and you were to measure from the outside in, you just wouldn't know they were there. So I'll just clarify that. So for years, I did measurements from the outside of a property, and there were certain things that I just could not figure out until I went inside. So what I would do is I would do the outside measurement, and I would use like a trundle wheel, which is hilariously inaccurate, but it was very effective and fast. So it is what it is. But you would measure the outside, and then in my area, there were a lot of houses that have half stories, which is just a way of saying there's a sloped ceiling, and then you have like a room built into that sloped area. And those have knee walls. And so the space, or sorry, the full perimeter or footprint of the first floor of the house is not the footprint of the second floor, not even close, right? Because the sloped ceilings shrink the room down to the width and length that is occupied by the floor in between the knee walls. So that means that's a fancy way of saying the second and third floors were sometimes vastly different than the first. So there's no way to know until I went into those houses and actually physically measured what the second or third stories were. Interior area, again, just the space inside the house, always better to measure from the inside out. And almost all technologies obviously use inside out, right? Because you're in the property for the purposes of documenting it anyway. Okay, the next one, exterior area. So this is a big one for real estate mostly. An exterior area, totals, also known sometimes as gross floor areas, are supposed to represent the entire footprint of the property, like walls and bricks and siding and everything, right? So you might think, okay, well, the best way to get this is from the outside then, since it's from the outside. And the answer is nope, it's the same as interior area. You still don't know what's going on inside that property unless you measure it from the inside. But with gross floor area, you're also adding to the interior area, the area occupied by the exterior walls. And there's lots of different ways to get that. You can do an outside measurement as well, and then compare, or you can add a wall thickness and do a multiplication, so another calculation on the perimeter. Long story short, however you get this number, this is the one that real estate professionals like to use to list. It's very popular. It's a bigger number, and it's sort of totally fair. Oh, ferocious guard cat. I did what did I do? A webinar podcast rather with for the We Get Around network, and my cat was like smushing the camera, knocking my tea off the table. It was awesome. I always wanted a cat who would just sit in the background and kind of silently judge. And now I have that, and I'm not sure how I feel about it. Either way, exterior area is really important because that's the one people want to use, and that's what they expect to use.
Well, so, depending on what you're trying to do, why you need the value of the square footage number may determine what number you want to use, right? So like you've heard of other people who inflate property values for certain reasons and then deflate them for other reasons.
Well, I mean, it does seem a bit ridiculous that that we have these different numbers. Like why do we have gross floor area at all or exterior area? Why not just throw that out and just always use interior area? It's more accurate anyway. But there really are also, here's another fun fact. I'm just full of fun facts today. There are no official measurement standards that have been adopted by, people across, say, North America. There's not like one standard. There are a few standards that one could use. There's ANSI and BOMA, but they have their place, and they're not really widely adopted. Well, by too many people. Measurement standards are sometimes based off ANSI. So the ones we referred to earlier, the ANSI is part of them, but they're not typically used by anyone to any great degree. Often when listing properties for real estate, it's very much sort of down to like the local MLS standards and what they require in terms of like reporting that square footage or listing it. There's no measurement standards per se. So that's frustrating.
Yeah.
Because if there were a measurement standard, fantastic.
Yeah.
We could all just use it.
Yeah.
But the process of measuring a property and determining a total can be really complicated, especially when you get into older housing stock where they're just weird, right? Like houses that are 70 years older and more are odd. They've got weird dormers and circular turrets and just all sorts of strange, wacky stuff. So that's a whole other separate challenge. But anyway, to summarize, exterior area typically used by real estate professionals. And that's why it exists. There's different ways to get it, but it's still better to measure from the inside out. The next one, it's going to sound really obvious when I say it, is occupied area. And you can compare that to common areas. So let's suppose that you're referring to a building, but within that building, there's a space, and that's the one that you're referring to. So occupied area would be that. So it's just basically a unit, like a condo or an apartment in a bigger building. So what I mean by that is, you don't, when you're creating a floor plan, you don't include like the hallway outside. So that's not part of the property really, right?
Yeah.
You can include it, but you could think of that more like almost like a site map. Although that can be there for context, it's really not relevant to the total square footage of that unit in particular. There is also, an interesting fact that typically you don't own the space beyond your walls in this scenario anyway. There's a few different ways to look at it. I think in some cases you might own like halfway in between or something between one unit and the next. So for example, in a townhome scenario where they're all lined up all in a row, the exterior area obviously isn't, it's the whole footprint, but then it's obviously cut like halfway in between the firewall. Mm-hmm. Between different properties.
The common walls, yeah.
Exactly. So it's kind of weird. It's not like you own the whole wall, you own half of it. It's very odd. So interior area really works for almost every property. Anything you can really use interior area. Exterior area is a little more risky, but it's really much more suited to detached properties and things that stand alone, because then they can have a full footprint. And then occupied area, which is just another way of saying interior area minus common spaces. Mm-hmm. Is what you would use for condos and apartments in any multi-unit residential scenario where you've got a lot of extra spaces that you could measure, but you don't. Okay. So covered all those. That's pretty good. Moving on. Let's talk about sources of square footage information. So we kind of briefly touched on this earlier. There are lots of different ways to get a total square footage for your house. And some of them are problematic and some of them are more problematic. So the most common way to get a square footage total across most of North America is to go online and like Google it, So I just blanket statement. This isn't so much a fun fact, it's just a hot tip. There you go. This is a hot tip. Anytime you're talking about square footage information, always start by asking questions, okay? Or floor plans as well. Floor plans and square footage information, any measurements at all of a property. And you want to ask a lot of questions because it's very common for people to say things that will create a lot of work for you as a professional trying to work with measurement data. So this is coming directly from my experience dealing with floor plans in the field. I'm halfway through shooting a property and someone walks over and they're like, yeah, so this house is 3,500 square feet. I hope your floor plans are that or bigger. And you're like, what? Yeah. I haven't measured the house yet, but they're going to be whatever size they are because I'm going to measure it. That's what you're paying me for. And those were always really awkward conversations. And what I found was that the number one way to keep yourself out of trouble with regards to the measurements and floor plans, because you should be familiar with measurements if you're going to get into this sort of business or you're going to start providing them. But you don't need to be a super hyper expert I'm not. I'm just comfortable with a lot of the concepts, and I can, if I don't have the information, I can find it, which is, I think, the key.
Yeah.
But when you're out and you're talking to people, the key is to ask questions. So that other thing I said was the most important thing. This is the second most important thing. Anytime you're dealing with floor plans and measurements of any kind, ask a lot of questions. So I'll give you a couple examples, but this has to do with typically dealing with your existing clients or possibly new clients, but also the existing sources of square footage information that you are currently using. So if you are using a provider, doesn't matter who they are, and they have, they're providing you with floor plans, for example, so you're not drawing them yourself, you're paying to have someone do it. Ask questions, a lot of them. How did you get this information? What tools did you use? I mean, you'll know because you did it, but what percentage of error are we looking at here? What is included and what's not included? So that kind of relates to our conversation earlier. If you do that, oh my gosh, you'll keep yourself out of a world of trouble. But here's the scenario. You're on site, you've got someone and they say something like, you're out in the middle of nowhere. You're not at a computer, so you can't just look it up, right? So someone says, hey, I got the floor plans back and it says 2,500 square feet, but the homeowner told me it was 3,000 square feet. So what happens in that conversation is that the onus is always going to initially be on you to check your numbers, because someone's always going to say, hey, the floor plans you gave me are wrong. Mm-hmm. What's up with that? So this is my hot tip. Don't say, oh, I'll check into that. I'll remeasure. Don't say any of that stuff. Start asking questions instead, because it saves you so much time. So much time. So say, okay, well, thank you for the feedback, but where did you get your square footage numbers from? Because I'll need that information to compare. And often this opens up a really great conversation. It sounds like a bad thing, but no, it's lemons into lemonade. Because if you're providing really accurate measurements, you can just straight up defend them, and they'll always be better than whatever the person brings to you most of the time. So this relates directly to this slide here, sources of square footage. So often what will happen is you will have someone say something like, oh, the tax assessments were done. They're saying it's 3,500. So, okay, no problem. It really depends on the area that you're in, but tax information was never designed, and public records were almost always never designed to be used to document a home in that way. They're designed to calculate things like property tax.
Yep.
So they don't have to be hyper accurate. Do you have a local tax assessment lookup thing in your area?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah, it's here you can look up by address, but it's kind of hard to get that information. But in some areas, it's like public; you can just look it up. And then the square footage totals are, they're sometimes they're close, sometimes they're way off. It's kind of all over the place.
Well, they want the number to be higher because they get more tax.
It's hard to say, really. Like in some cases, it's about adjusting the amount for the area. Like I don't really know the insides and outs of the way tax money is determined, but they're not really trying to necessarily get more or less. They're trying to get the right amount for that area. I mean, I assume they want more, actually, now that you've said it. I don't know. Either way.
Well, sometimes those numbers can be way off. Let's
put it
that way.
Exactly. So in the area that I used to live, in Southern Ontario in Canada anyway, they require you to, if you do use the tax records, you have to use a range. So you can't just say, so if their system says 1,500 square feet, they specifically mandate that if you're going to use that information according to their terms of service, you have to say, between 1,000 and 1,500 or something like that. Mm-hmm. Like you're not allowed to use their number. They made it very clear. It's still done, but that tells you how accurate they think it is. If they're like, you can't use that number, you need to use a range. And that makes sense because to my point earlier, that type of measurement is done from the outside in. So if the perimeter of a property is very simple and there's no funny business up in the upper stories, okay, that might work. But if there's anything odd about it, or if there's any fake elements, I mean, you can't tell sometimes from the outside of a house if a dormer is real or not. So give you an example, that can affect the square footage to a sort of fairly huge degree. And any source of square footage information off the internet is suspect like this, like anything from Zillow or any previous listings, which brings us to our next fun fact. What have we had? 2 now? So the measurement information in a general sense has a time limit. Not everybody knows this. So let's suppose that you measured a property 5 years ago. and you want to list it now. That measurement information is old. You can't use it, not until you verify it, and so it's relatively current, like, within the last few months.
So that doesn't make sense. So you're saying my house is either growing or shrinking?
Well, right. So that's the question. So in all likelihood, if you have lived in your house and you have done no modifications, then you can be very confident that floor plans you made ages ago are still accurate. But if you haven't lived in that house, like let's suppose you had the floor plans made, or they were made, I don't know, 5 years ago, and you moved in 2 years ago, without a third party to verify those floor plans, there's a lot of risk there, because those could differ from what is currently available. And I mean, it's little things like they added a closet, or they did this thing with the, but little things matter. Yeah. So that's the fun fact, is that if you have measurement data and it looks great, but it's really old, you really should have it verified by a third party. So if you have one of the good sources that we're about to talk about. So public records, just to summarize, those were never meant for anything other than taxes. So they really shouldn't be used, and they're not very accurate. The next one, though, this will get you into so much trouble, is builder's plans. So builder's plans are awesome because they're, usually very pretty and well drawn, but they were never designed to be a representation of the actual property as it exists. Those are like a recipe for a house. Those existed before the property was even made. So if talk about timely, you really have to get those verified by a third party. And it's different all over North America, but different housing industries and markets have different rules for how they're allowed to report square footage before a property is sold. And those rules can differ from the rules for listing a property for resale or for anything else. So that means that builder's plans, although they look really good because they're designed to sell a home, they are not necessarily accurate and need to be verified. So it's really interesting when you get into multi-unit residential buildings, like an apartment building. Sometimes they'll use one floor plan and they'll just scale it up to every unit. They'll use it for all the units. They're not going to draw a separate floor plan for every unit, right? Mm-hmm. But those units will have all sorts of differences as you get up higher. Bulkheads and the thickness of the concrete will change, all sorts of wacky stuff. So builder's plans look awesome, and you're totally going to get called out on them if you start doing floor plans and measurements, because someone will say, oh, I don't need floor plans. I've got these ones here, from the builder that were made like 20 years ago. So they're also out of date. But basically, builders' floor plans are notoriously not meant to be even accurate. Like I said, they're a recipe for a property. They're not actually, they don't actually reflect the property as it currently exists.
And I can attest to that.
It happens a lot.
I built this house that I'm in right now, and there are parts of it where it's like, no, I don't like the way that's just bumped that wall out. Like that corner was like cut across. I'm like, no, sure. Like, so it's not a lot of difference, but there are for differences.
Sure. Yeah, I get you. Modifications during, 100%. But I shot a house once in the previous city I lived in, and the fella, he'd been there through the whole building process. Like it was, builder was doing a whole cul-de-sac, and he had picked one house, and he got them to do a whole bunch of changes during construction. And we were comparing the floor plans with the actual ones, and it wasn't that, like to your point, it wasn't that big a difference, but he had made some really weird changes that looked very odd, because they built in like this corner fireplace, and that takes quite a bit out.
Yeah. I took out a fireplace. I was like, I don't need that many fireplaces.
I have a fireplace in this house, and honestly, we turn it on and we admire it for like 5 minutes, and then we turn it back off again. Yeah. So it's kind of like, I don't know, they are what they are. So the last source that I'll mention prior to we're talking about the do-it-yourself method is the service provider method. So that means hiring someone to do it. So there are a zillion advantages to hiring someone to do it, which we could talk about if we have enough time later, but I'll just hit you up with a whole bunch of them. It's faster. It's more accurate most of the time because the tools are better. Often an experienced draftsperson can figure things out from the data that I would never be able to figure out in a do-it-yourselfer scenario. Like I'm just not that smart. And they're often of like a higher quality, if that makes any sense. Sometimes so when you're doing do it yourself, often you're really just focused, if you don't have a lot of experience, on just getting it done. You're not trying to make it pretty. Whereas some of the services that you can use, they look nice, basically color coding and all that stuff. So why don't we talk about how to measure a floor plan yourself? So if these sources, you don't want to hire somebody, you don't want to use the tax records, which you shouldn't, and you don't want to use a builder's plan, or you don't have one. Actually, just to that point, builder's plans, I'll just go back to that for 1 second. You totally can use them if you verify them. So if you measure the property and you're like, nope, this is 100% accurate, then you can use it, it's fine. But the do-it-yourself method is very popular with people when they're trying to, get to grips with measurement. And because I've worked at iGuide, I've had a lot of experience talking with people who are, interested in creating their own floor plans. And, for whatever reason, they settled on iGuide. There's lots of good ones, just saying. But there are different types of people. So I'm going to give you some tricks and some tips to understand if doing floor plans is right for you. So okay. Because I've gotten to see a lot of people deal with floor plans and measurement data, I've seen some people succeed and some people fail. And so it makes you wonder, well, okay, why do some people have no problem with floor plans and other people just struggle with them?
Yeah.
So there are like different types of brain chemistry. Now, I don't know the science. This is all anecdotal. So it's going to sound very scientific. It's not. But some people really just do a great job of understanding two-dimensional representations of space. Like they even enjoy it. You know what I mean? It's like reading maps. They look at the data and they love to draw it out and they really enjoy that process. And if that's your thing, cool. Okay. Then doing it yourself is totally for you. If you look at floor plans and you're really uncomfortable with them, and you've tried to maybe draw a few and you're really struggling, there could be a very good reason for that. And that just might be that you're just not as comfortable as in a brain wise with understanding those two-dimensional representations of space. And that's not something that you can't overcome. A lot of people, start and they struggle at first, but then they get really into it. But the do-it-yourself method can be very time consuming and very, very frustrating for people who just aren't naturally inclinated to understanding two-dimensional representations of space. And I can say from my own experience that I absolutely sucked at it at first. But then I was kind of forced to do it and I got much, much better like relatively quickly. Like, I mean, maybe, I don't know, 20, 30 houses, something like that. You get into the swing and then you stop worrying about the basics and you start worrying more about like weird stuff like circular rooms and strange staircases and whatever. But the service provider solution makes sense for people who are busy. So if you've already got a workflow where you're like shooting 5 houses a day, well, you're going to add floor plans onto that and draw them yourself? Probably not. For people who just, the service providers, route makes sense for people who just don't like drawing floor plans, who just don't enjoy it, and then don't want to invest in learning different software and learning the process as well, and then, getting the experience. Okay, that being said, I'm going to describe how you would create a floor plan on your own. That way, if someone listens to this and they want to give it a try, they totally can. Okay, so step one is to get some tools. So on screen, you can see a pencil and graph paper and a tape measure. You could use a tape measure, but don't use a tape measure. You're going to have to splash some cash for a laser measurement thing. You absolutely can use a tape measure, but it's not a fun process. And it's not super accurate because you'll have tape sag.
Yeah.
And then when you're trying to measure something, it's just awkward when you have long space. You have to have a partner hold it for you. Like it's not really very practical long term. Like if you're just going to do your own house, sure. But if you're going to actually create something like floor plans and measure a property for practical reasons, you really want to do that. But laser distance measures, they're not super expensive now. I actually can't think of off the top of my head how much like a Bosch one would be. $100 maybe less now. I don't know. Either way, worthwhile investment if you're going to do this yourself. And what you would do is you would get your laser distance measure, your graph paper, and your pencil, and you would enter a home, and you would begin typically at the front door. You can start wherever you want, but that's where most people start. And you would begin to draw boxes, lots of boxes, hence the graph paper. And so there's a few different sort of techniques that people use. One of them is to always follow a left wall and just go in the same direction and follow an interior wall. That works. You don't want to miss a space, so that's why you kind of have a systematic approach and go space by space, one by one. But what you're going to do is, on your graph paper, you're going to walk into a room and you're going to measure the length and the width, and then you're going to draw that box approximately. You're going to get close, and you're going to write down your length and your width. And then what you're going to do after you've drawn your box is you're going to identify openings in the room, and you're going to measure for those openings. And you're going to record the numbers. You're going to say, okay, this window starts, 5 feet from this intersection, and it, continues for 3 feet, and then it stops again, and it continues 10 feet to the next intersection. So, you're really, to make it more visual, you're really looking at this as drawing a floor plan. It's not going to be to scale, obviously, not until later, because you're just working with graph paper. But working with graph paper means that you can approximate scale by making 5 feet 1 square or whatever, so you can make your life a little easier. It's a tough skill to get, but as you go and you get better at it, people can do it so fast. They can draw it really, really quickly when they do it. Not perfectly to scale, but close enough. So you're going to identify doorways. You're going to identify windows, any opening in a space, and then you're going to move from space to space, and you're going to keep drawing box after box after box. Now, depending on how sophisticated you're going to get, you may also identify things like the door placement. So if there's a bifold, you would draw in a little note, like a bifold door. And you may also indicate door swings, so which direction the door is swinging. In addition to that, you can add as much detail to a floor plan as you want while you're creating it. So that means you can add fixtures and toilets and sinks. And if you wish to, when you go into a kitchen, there's a lot going on there. You can measure the length and the width, but you can also measure the cupboards. So, after you've got the openings, you can say, okay, we're gonna include these, measure the cupboards, and then draw those in with their measurements. And then you can place the fixtures on them and the appliances in there as well. The goal being to move systematically through the property, drawing square or rectangle, I should say, after rectangle, identifying all of these key features. Now, so the key trick here is to do your best to eliminate human error. And this is the biggest challenge with the do-it-yourself floor plan solution, is human error. And I have made this mistake. I shouldn't say mistake. I've had this happen so many times where I've gone and I've like measured a property. And then later I'm looking at my notes and I'm like, oh no, is that a 7 or is that a 9? And I'm like, and it's just, you're guessing. You're like, that's probably a 7. But you can check your other measurements. You can say, okay, well, this wall's that. And then so if I take that and I look at the sum, okay, so that was a 7. So that's my favorite reason. Actually, I've got 2 good reasons why the service provider method, choosing something like iGuide or someone who creates floor plans, is the way to go. So human error is a big part of it. In that I always second guess my work after the fact. And that's something very difficult to fix. You know what I mean? Like if I measure wrong, that just keeps me up at night. So I hate that. But then the other reason is that sometimes you're going to come across spaces that are octagonal or circular, and those are very challenging to cut up into boxes. Staircases is very similar. They're also quite weird. When you are software, we haven't discussed any particular software. I probably won't bring up anyone specifically, but software often will have special tools for adding staircases and things in. So it's a big deal, but it's not as big a deal as you'd think. But just the measurement on site of a circular space is awful. So that's my main reason for preferring the service provider method over the do-it-yourself. Also, it's a lot of work, Yeah. Especially for floor plans, it takes forever. It feels like it takes forever. And if you get better at it, you can do it pretty quick. You can do it in 15, 20 minutes. But it's funny. Like I used to drive up to houses and I would just, fingers crossed, just please be simple. Please be a simple house. And I'd like open my eyes and I'd look and it'd be like a 1-story like bungalow. And then other times it'd be like a Victorian mansion with all sorts of weird wraparound porches and turrets and stuff. And they were so awful. So that's a very compelling reason not to do it yourself. But that being said, the do-it-yourself method, like I said, prone to human error. So there's a trick. So when you are creating floor plans yourself, you always bring a camera, you should, and you should take a zillion photos of everything. They don't have to be pretty. They don't have to have corrected verticals or any of that stuff. Take a zillion photos. And if you think about it, that is really the way that floor plans are drawn remotely
Yeah.
based on data from a camera system, right?
Yeah.
People are looking at the data, but then they also look at the visuals and they say, okay, that window's there. And then, I see the doors go this way.
Yeah.
If you do that, oh my gosh, you keep yourself out of so much trouble. It really helps eliminate any questions. So if I'm looking at my data later and I see something that's not quite right and it doesn't square with my memory, no problem. I say, oh, I don't know if the sink was there. I just look at the photo and I say, oh yeah, there it is. Cool. So that's like a super helpful part of the process. The last step, so you've gone to a property, you've measured the whole thing manually, you've got all the data that you need. So it's going to vary from like property to property, obviously. Every property is a little different. Then you're going to have to find some software and you're going to begin to draw, and the first thing you're going to do in all of it doesn't matter what software you use. There's lots of free ones online at floorplanner.com. And then there's House Pro lets you draw stuff. I forget. Anyway, you don't have to get AutoCAD or anything. There's lots of different ones. But you're going to set a scale and then you're going to start drawing to scale. So your drawing that you made on site is not going to really look like what you're drawing in the software. Because what you drew on site is an approximation. It's the numbers that matter, the things that you measured.
Right.
And then depending on the software that you use, they're all a little different, but they're going to do some of the heavy lifting for you in most cases in terms of determining square footage totals. So often they'll sum the interior area for you and you'll be able to change the wall thickness, and sort of draw in those details and it'll just calculate it all for you, which is quite cool. That's super handy. And then the last part, so I'm not going to go into detail because we're running out of time, but the last part of that process is obviously creating something with that information that you can then deliver, creating an actual deliverable. So that deliverable is almost always like floor plans of some sort. And when you're presenting that deliverable, I'm saying everything is the most important, but this is for sure the most important thing. You have to communicate what it is that you're giving to your client, whoever that may be, accurately so that they know what they're getting, so that they don't accidentally misrepresent the property. Because again, that's the biggest risk, right? Mm-hmm. So when you draw out your floor plans and you've calculated your areas, you need to be able to make sure that when you're giving them to someone, you say, okay, this is, the total square footage of the property as I've calculated it. And on the floor plans, depending on what software you've used, there may be color coding to show what's included and what's not. So I'll give you a few examples of things that aren't typically included in total square footages. And those would be represented on the floor plan by different shading, or they might not be colored or whatever. So 3-season, like screened in areas typically are not included as part of the property. Cold cellars, if you have those, are up north. Typically like porches and anything that's on the exterior, decks, that kind of stuff's not included. Area behind knee walls, I mentioned that before. None of that stuff is typically included. There's probably some other weirder examples. Attached garages, actually, that's the best example. So typically attached garages are not conditioned space and are therefore not considered as being part of the total square footage. The most important, I would say, aspect to communicate though is what your client can use and what they should use it for. So if you've got someone who in your area wants to use that gross floor area, you would ask them, you'd say, okay, what area are you going to use to list? And then you would point them in that right direction so that they would know, okay, I'm looking at the floor plans. I see the number here, exterior area or gross floor area, whatever you call it. That's the one that I should be using. Okay. But it's kind of funny. Sometimes there needs to be a conversation about this because everyone's area that they live in is different. Obviously, it's an obvious thing to say. But what people consider to be part of that listing square footage differs as well. So in my area, basements don't count. You just take them right out. And if you don't have basements, obviously they don't count. If you're in Florida or California, there's no basements. So if you're in an area where basements do count, sometimes there are rules. Maybe half the basement is above grade. It's a walkout. Okay, all of a sudden, well, now that in some areas that's considered important. You include that. In Western Canada, they just straight up include basements. So there you put them in. And you need to get that out of the way right away because you don't want any confusion or question. So to my point earlier, often when you start getting into measurement, you're going to present your numbers to people and they're going to differ from their expectations. And that's, I would say, if you were going to pick out the biggest challenge of starting with floor plans and measurement, it's really adjusting people's expectations to sort of like reality, if that makes any sense.
And sometimes educating people.
Oh, 100%. There's a huge education process. Yes, absolutely. But it's different for everybody. So some people they get it, they're on board, and some people have no idea. Now, the best part about people who have no idea, well, it's not educating them. That sucks. That's extra work. But the best part is that often they don't fully appreciate the value of the thing that they're buying from you, like floor plans. But if you get the opportunity to explain it, it's hard to ignore. Like, it's, you got to know what you're selling. It helps people plan. It helps you list. It helps in the closing process. Like, there's all these benefits. So if you can communicate that to people, fantastic. That's great. You just made yourself more valuable because you're offering that service. So that's, kind of wonderful, right? I would say that 9 times out of 10, when people are ordering a floor plan, I wouldn't say 9 times out of 10, that's too much. Frequently, when people order a floor plan or some sort of measurement, they're just doing it because they are required to, or they see it as a high value add-on sort of item that they're sort of interested in, and for marketing purposes. They don't really see the value. So if you can communicate that value, it can be huge. Like, that can really help boost your business. This will be my last fun fact because we're running out of time. What I've found is that when I'm measuring properties, I'm there on site, I'm doing real estate photography. I'm also measuring the property. I'm creating a tour. Often people really, to my earlier point just now, don't really understand what it is that they're buying. They kind of get floor plans, but they don't really get all the other stuff that goes along with those. So often what I'll do is I'll set expectations like at the door, because you'll have questions. Pre-COVID, there was more like one-on-one time with people like homeowners and agents, but we'll get back there eventually, right? But often people would ask, they'd say, "Oh, what are you going to do?" And I'd say, "Look, I'm going to go through the property. I'm going to shoot a bunch of beautiful photos for listing, but then I'm going to take, my technology, and I'm going to go throughout the property. I'm going to measure each room space by space. And, once that's done, in a day, we're going to have full floor plans, and this whole space will be measured. We'll know exactly how big it is. And those floor plans are going to be available, in PDF. They'll be available online. You can measure on them. And people can really get an understanding of the space without going to the space, which means more now than it has ever before, right? Mm-hmm. So especially with like hot markets, and then virtual showings, regular showings being more challenging, right? Getting people the information that they want without going to the property it's safer, it's more cost effective, it's just like a better system overall. So when I explain that on site, people are often like, "Oh, that's amazing. That's so cool." And having that conversation right then and there, you're giving, the appearance of having, really understanding your stuff, but also, you're showing the value that you're bringing right away. And often the homeowner's curious, you're letting them understand what's going on. The agent's really happy because they're like, "Oh, this guy knows what he's doing. I'm glad I hired him." Right. And it means that the next time you go do a shoot for that person, or you're out on site, if they've heard this before, they already know, like they get it, right? So you're educating everyone, but at the same time, you're doing it like you're already there anyway. So you might as well be friendly and tell everybody how important floor plans are. Okay, that's it for me. That was a lot of talking. I'm sorry. Did you have any questions about any of that stuff I just said?
No, I think
that was epic.
That was a lot of good information. I do think I have a few things to add. So there are a lot of service providers out there who offer floor plans, right? I would just say, do your research, be careful. Some of them are better than others.
Yeah, I can directly speak to that without, slinging any mud. Like, lots of people provide floor plans, and it's really important to ask questions about those floor plans. What's included, what's not included, what tools were used, although you probably know anyway, but, misrepresenting a property is a bad thing. But losing clients is a really bad thing. So if you provide someone with floor plans and they're not all created equal, I think, to your point just now. Mm-hmm. So if you provide someone with bad floor plans once, that can ruin it. They'll never call you back.
It could be a total liability issue too. So
Exactly.
I mean, the one thing about iGuide is you have the camera that has the laser measurement tool, right?
Yeah.
Hardware.
Yeah.
So it's going to be more
would,
accurate, right?
Well, I mean, I'm biased, obviously, but yes. So with iGuide, what you're really doing is you are using technology to measure a space first and then create a 3D tour second. So the measurement is critical. And there are a whole bunch of advantages that really are hard to quantify, but are so awesome. So I'll just run you through a few. One, the draftspeople who draw iGuide floor plans are amazing. They're amazing. They're so good at what they do. We did this little recruiting thing at a local college. They're always looking for new drafters, And we were in Kitchener and we were at college, and they set up this little computer and they were showing the process of doing the drafting. And they're like wizards. Like their hands move so fast. It's crazy. But they have that really good understanding of two-dimensional spaces based on data combined with like experience like you could never get, like tens of thousands of properties drawn. So when they do it, they're literally like wizards. And so they have the experience to see things that I might, as a do-it-yourselfer, would never even be able to touch. So that means that on the back end, there's far fewer revisions. So if I draw a floor plan and I submit it to my client, or if I get it from someone who's not experienced, basically I give it to them and they look at it and go, that's not right. That door's wrong, and that, the microwave's not there. What are you doing? So then I got to go back, redraw it myself, or have someone else redraw it, and it's a pain. It's horrible. And then every time you have to do that, it hurts your credibility. So with iGuide, there are occasional issues. There's things that people can't physically see, like where a wall is in between two closets or something. So they doesn't affect the square footage, so they'll often guess that if they don't have the data. But they don't like to guess. They like to draw directly from the data. And that means that there's just very few revisions. They're very good. Also, oh yeah, I forgot to show you guys this. Sorry. With iGuide, you have the method of measurement. So when we talk about what is included and what's not included, it's like baked in. You can click on this link on any iGuide and read all of the really boring area stuff I talked about. So it's not something that's like hidden. It's not like a disclaimer at the bottom of the floor plans that say these measurements might not be real or accurate. It's none of that. Those are cop-outs, right? This is a very clear representation, setting expectations for what is included and what is not. And that is really important if you're going to yourself speak to that measurement information and kind of, have to defend it in some cases. And when you use that technique I talked about earlier about asking questions, this might be a little overkill in certain circumstances, but you can totally load up something like this if you have an iGuide. You can say, okay, well, let's see what's included and what's not here. Let me load up the method of measurement for iGuide and we'll go through it. And the amount of credibility that you bring when you can do something like that is like massive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Absolutely huge. Here, let's see. Is there anything else? Competitors, accuracy. Oh yeah. The one last thing. Okay. We'll cap it off with my one last thing I wanted to talk about. And that's the combination of measurement floor plans with something more creative and splashy. So we always struggle with measurement in that it's not like sexy, if I'm being honest. A lot of people are not super excited about it, right? But like a cool drone video that like has a flyby over a river and like there's a waterfall. I mean, okay, yeah, that's awesome, right?
Yeah.
But from my experience, the combination of really, really good creative work like photos and video combined with the really, really rock solid foundation of floor plans and measurements was like the killer combo. Like it helped me get so much business when I was still doing real estate photography. So what would often happen is that something like a 3D tour would get me in the door. People would want something that I'm offering, and often people are willing to experiment. Not all the time, but they're willing to try things out. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of pressure in for example, a brokerage environment for real estate professionals to try new things and to bring something new to the table for their associates. So often floor plans or a 3D tour, something like that would get me in. People would say, "Oh, that's so cool. I want to try that out." But because it's not sexy, it wouldn't necessarily keep me there all the time, unless measurements were required for listing. But having that combo of like really rock solid still images, maybe a video component, and floor plans and measurements, like you're unstoppable. Because why would someone hire anyone else? Because you're giving them everything. There's often this sort of like hesitance in the sort of real estate photography area to want to be a catch-all, like just do everything. And there's something to that. Like typically you pick a specialty, like you're really into, I don't know, drone video or whatever. Like you pick something you get really, really good at. That's totally fair. That makes sense. But having technology like an iGuide camera where you can shoot a 3D tour and get floor plans and have it all done like really, really fast, it means you can add it onto your business. And you don't need to learn a whole lot. I mean, you need to learn a bit about measurements and know what you're talking about, but you should know that anyway, if you're working in real estate. So for me personally, having really great still photos, then being able to do walkthrough videos, and then having the floor plans plus measurements meant I was like one-stop shop.
Yeah.
Why would anyone ask for anything else? Now they always did ask for weird stuff. They'd be like, "Hey, can you do an interview with me on the front lawn?" I'm like, "No, I can't." Yes, I could have done that if you told me, but not right now. But that allowed me to get into scenarios where it made me very sticky. It was very difficult to like get rid of me. And it sounds negative, but like in a good way. So, I'd have people and they used a guy. They had a guy, right? Like, I've had a photographer for 6 years. He's really nice, but he can't even do a fraction of what you do.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's not like the cost is that high to add on floor plans, considering they're considered a high value sort of item. And because I was able to provide that, because iGuide, another benefit for fun, was next business day. There was no delay or anything. It was like, you get everything, video, stills, floor plan, 3D tour, the whole 9 yards, all the next day. And that made it very difficult to compete with, which was awesome. But what happens is that everyone kind of gets to that place where they're sort of offering a list of services. And what really differentiates you is not necessarily the sexy measurements and the, floor plans, although those are awesome. Often it's that combination of services, that mix that you offer, that recipe. That's gonna be different for everybody, obviously. But for me, it was the really good photos and then measurements in the 3D tour.
Yeah, I agree. Totally. Wow. Awesome. Thank you. Thanks so much for all that information. I hope that everybody watching has learned something. And if you have more questions, his name is Chris White. He's from iGuide, so you can hit him up.
It's true. Yeah. Go to goiGuide.com.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Let's stop sharing your screen.
Perfect. There we
Yay. Go. So, I hope that everybody's enjoyed this. We went a little bit longer, but that's okay. And
sorry.
Thank you so much, Chris, for joining. Thank you, everybody, for watching. I hope you've had as much fun as I have. I will see you again in 2 weeks. And until then, take care. See you then. Bye.